how many of you have ever seen a circus show? Any kind of circus, not Cirque du Soleil or anything. Okay. The hands were so fast, I didn't get to see them. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So a fair amount of people have seen circus shows. So for about 200 years, the way that circus shows worked were you would have one act. So it would be like a man playing with tigers, and then the lights would go down, and then a person would come out and say, you have just seen a man playing with tigers. And now you're going to see a woman juggle. And the lights would go down, and the lights would come up, and then there would be a woman, and she would juggle, and the lights would come down. And then would come out and say, wasn't that wonderful? The woman just juggled. Now you're going to see a bunch of acrobats from Russia do somersaults. And the lights go down, lights go up. A bunch of acrobats from Russia are doing acrobatics, lights go down, etc., etc., etc. So this is how things were from about 1780 to about 1980. This is the way that circus dealt with the problem that you had many different acts that had nothing to do with each other. They were coming from different countries, they were completely different styles, and it just didn't make sense to all of a sudden go from a man with tigers to a woman juggling to a bunch of acrobats from Russia. All of that changed in 1984 when some companies recognized that it may actually be more interesting to find a way to connect these very different acts together in a way that gave a certain flow, and that it would put some images together in the minds of the audience, so that instead of seeing act, 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 you would see an entire show. And they started asking, oh, maybe instead of just having the acts lined up in order of how exciting they are, from the quiet acts to the most exciting acts, maybe we could find some value in putting acts together that have a big contrast, have a quiet act followed by a loud act, followed by a sad act, followed by a small act, followed by a big act. And this is what they called New Circus, and this is where the company that I worked for before coming to Wharton made their name. So this is how Cirque du Soleil became very famous, was by first of all getting rid of tiger acts. So you were already taking care of about 1/3 of the acts that had nothing to do with each other, but also by finding a way to put acts that had nothing to do with each other together in such a way that were very interesting. And most of that work came into how do you transition from one act to another. So the goal of this workshop is to teach you the very basic tools that a company like Cirque du Soleil uses to try and put together very different acts with the constraints of money, with the constraints of time, in such a way that every act is making every other act look better. Right? So in a sense, every act is lifting each other up, and you end up supporting each other at a higher level than you would have been with each act together. That was a lot of information in circus history in about 5 minutes. But I'm curious if there's any questions or thoughts about what I've talked about.
So when you say the expectation for transitions in the show, is it that, because I think of two transitions, there's like a really fluid one where like literally their music fades into our music and we're moving on and off stage simultaneously, versus just like they're posing and the light, like even if the lights don't go out, it's just they run off and we run on in a way that's just time efficient. So how much synergy are we aiming for?
That's a great question. So the standard model that we're going to be using, the constraints for each transition, are as follows. We're assuming that every act is about, say, 3 to 5 minutes in general, maybe some a little bit longer, some a little shorter. So each act will be 3 to 5 minutes, and each act has its own music. Okay? None of that changes. We're also assuming that each act at the end has some kind of moment where that act stands up, or at least freezes, and gets the applause from the audience. Okay? So we're assuming that's the base case for every act. Act with music, stop, audience, clap. At that point, so let's have Act 1 and Act 2. So there's music for Act 1, music for Act 2. Music for Act 2 music, the Act 2 coordinator, I should say, is going to have about 30 seconds to 1 minute. That would be the goal. So it's a very short presentation where all of their artists are going to enter from off stage. All of the Act 1 artists are going to leave the stage, and it's going to be a separate music for that transition. So that would be the idea.
And if the music that the second act has, you know, some songs have like an introduction, like the beat didn't drop yet, and it's just, can we use that music so that it's like it literally leads into the song?
You absolutely could. So what we're doing is the standard WICS act up until this point has typically been a lights down, lights up act, right? So what that means is that there were two separate cases. Either Act 1 would finish, they would get their applause, lights out, everybody leaves in the dark. Everybody for Act 2 enters in the dark, lights come up, and then the performance happens. Okay? That was case 1. Case 2 would be the act does their performance, everybody exits, and they come back on, they get their applause, everybody leaves, and then everybody from Act 2 walks in silence, places themselves, and then music begins. Okay? So that was the different case. It sounds like what you're talking about, and tell me if I'm wrong, you actually already had an entrance in mind for your artists with the music introducing, and they're coming on from off stage?
Right.
So it sounds like you already have a transition. That was neither the first case or the second case. So you would actually be able to use your introduction music, and you would just have to find a way to help the act that's before you get off in a way that's going to not interfere with your artist coming on. Like a crossfade, essentially. So crossfades are always options if you have that, but we're trying to help especially the coordinators who are in a situation where they have their starting position and they have their end position. And we're trying to find a way to tie everybody's end position to everybody's starting position. So if you're in a starting case, just raise. It sounds like you have a very strong first image in mind.
Oh, no, I have some ideas, but
Okay.
I'm not married to any of them yet.
All right. So the goal of this is to not put any additional constraints on act coordinators. So we're not trying to change the way that you're seeing the beginning of your piece or change the way you're seeing the end of the piece. What we're doing here is everything that's supposed to happen from the end of the piece before you to the beginning of your piece. And if you're in a situation where you have a very specific beginning, there's a lot of options that we have. We can either have you come in after one of the transitions, because we have some MCs who come in and come out. So if you really have a very specific introduction that you want, a very special image of people coming on and you need to have an empty stage, then your piece can come right after one of those, for example. Or it can come right after intermission, or it might be one of the first pieces, or however it may be. So there's a lot of options. But what we're trying to do here is try and help the coordinators who just have a beginning and an end and don't know how to transition. Any other questions?
Question. So people will know, it's not that in any way I say I prefer that being introduced when the acts are being introduced, but they will know what's going on by the program.
They'll have a program and we'll be introducing probably 3 to 5 acts at a time. So the acts will happen in a block of like 5
Right.
acts.
Yeah.
These are all good questions.
How many acts total are there?
I'll have to defer to the WICS team.
16 or 17 for now.
So maybe four blocks of 4.
Totally is like 2 hours, 1.5 hours.
Time-wise, we haven't decided yet. We need to know more about how much time each individual act takes. It should be 2 to 3 hours.
So another question could be, who decides which act comes before yours and after yours? So if anyone has already put some thought into that, we're totally open. Or
So the base case is going to be that once the list of acts, because there's still acts that are coming in and still acts that are changing their minds, we're going to sit down and do a full storyboard. And we're going to be looking for interesting things to compare and contrast between acts. For example, there may be 2 percussion acts. Traditional wisdom would say, well, if you have 2 percussion acts, have them very far away from each other in the show so that people don't feel like they're seeing 2 drumming acts at the same time. But we're probably, in this case, we're going to actually put them together, because you'll have one drumming act that maybe say Irish style drumming, and then maybe a Japanese style drumming. And the transition that happens between the 2 of those would actually show the contrast between the Irish cultural show and the Japanese cultural show. And so we'll probably go through and we'll try and make sure that every act has something in common or very different from the act before, and so on, to make a nice chain of interesting cultural comparisons and contrasts. But again, the same thing, if there's anyone that you're working with and you already have a transition in mind, let us know so that we keep this in the back of our minds as we're trying to put everything together. But looking at people's faces, it seems that you're just focusing on your act right now, which is totally fine. We're providing that service of putting together an interesting program for you.
To what extent do we have a say in how, like, lighting, or if there's like a video backdrop, or just kind of more of the visual effects around the performance?
I'm going to defer to WICS on this as well, unless you want me to answer.
I just asked an email to Annabelle to see what we can do, but I expect that we can use the back screen and side screen, and we can also get help from Annabelle's staff in terms of light and music. Thanks. I don't know for now.
Like, do they have like the programmable kind, or do they have like the kind where you need to tell someone, like, okay, at this beat, I want you to turn the light on? Because the manual kind means coordinating with someone who sits there and like knows your dance, versus you program the timing and it runs.
To that point, I still need to have a meeting with Annabelle. I just said initial email, and then I will follow up with them. And
I can give a little bit of background on that, if you'd like. So they don't have moving lights, so they only have fixed lights. And what they'll do when you do the technical meeting with them, they're going to program different scenes of lighting. So for example, you'll have like, okay, I have a solo moment, I have a group moment, or for example, I have blue lights at this time, I have red lights at this time.